August 6th, 1945, 8:15 hours. Inside the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the war had already become an exercise in managed despair. 3 years of catastrophic defeats had been rationalized as tactical setbacks, not strategic collapse. The underground war room, buried 90 feet beneath the Imperial Palace, encased in 4 feet of reinforced concrete, buzzed with the ritual hum of reports and coded transmissions. Yet, even here, deep under the earth, the illusion of control was about to disintegrate. Field Marshal Shinroku Hada's morning intelligence briefing followed its usual rhythm: enemy movements, resource shortages, fuel rationing. But the steel doors crashed open before he could finish. Lieutenant Colonel Tishi Yamamoto, pale and trembling, burst into the chamber without the customary bow. In his hands was a decoded transmission from the Hiroshima Regional Command. The message was short, fragmented, and world-shattering. Entire city destroyed by single bomb. Blast radius exceeds all previous bombardment. Unknown weapon type. Casualties catastrophic. Request immediate. The transmission had cut off mid-sentence. General Yoshijiro Umezu, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, read the words 3 times in disbelief. His first thought was arithmetic. Hiroshima covered 27 square miles, a city of 350,000 people. Even the most devastating firebombing raid required hundreds of aircraft and hours of saturation. Yet, weather reconnaissance had reported only 3 B-29 bombers over Hiroshima that morning. 3, not 300. Impossible. By 10 hours, reconnaissance flights attempting to reach the city were forced to turn back, reporting a column of smoke and light rising 40,000 feet into the air. The pilots described colors that no fire had ever produced: purples, silvers, and oranges, pulsing like a living entity. From 150 miles away, the cloud was still visible. One officer compared it to a volcano erupting inside the sky. At 11:30 hours, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo received the first eyewitness testimony, a railway inspector who had been 15 miles outside Hiroshima. His account was transcribed immediately: a flash brighter than 1,000 suns, then a wave that threw trains from their tracks. The man said the city center had vanished, replaced by a silent inferno visible from the distant mountains. By early afternoon, every remaining assumption of the Imperial High Command was collapsing in real time. The Supreme War Council convened in suffocating silence at 14 hours. Prime Minister Kantaro Suzuki, once nearly assassinated for even suggesting peace talks, placed the collected reports before the ministers. His hands shook slightly. "Gentlemen," he began, "we must consider what this means." War Minister General Korechika Anami, the unyielding voice of resistance, broke the silence. "American propaganda. They wish us to believe in weapons that do not exist. Hiroshima was destroyed by conventional bombing. They exaggerate to weaken our resolve." Before he could finish, Admiral Soemu Toyota, Chief of the Naval General Staff, interrupted a breach of decorum so shocking it froze the room. 3 aircraft, Anami-san. We tracked them. We observed them. 3. No one spoke after that. In that moment, decades of belief in the supremacy of spirit over science began to fracture. Japan's entire military doctrine, the faith that willpower could overcome material power, now faced annihilation by arithmetic. For 3 years, Japan's leaders had told themselves that America's industrial advantage was an illusion, that mass production could be offset by courage, that technological superiority was a substitute for soul. Even as America built 300,000 aircraft, Japan consoled itself with the idea that one samurai's will equaled 10 machine-made men. Yet this single bomb had accomplished what thousands of aircraft could not. It suggested that America's power was not merely quantitative, it was categorical. By late afternoon, intelligence officer Colonel Hideaki Sato was called to present a new analysis. For years, his department had tracked American industrial statistics with chilling accuracy. 88,410 tanks produced by the U.S. versus Japan's 6,450, 41 aircraft carriers to Japan's 15. Factories that could launch cargo ships faster than U-boats could sink them. But today, numbers meant nothing. Sato's voice was nearly a whisper. If the Americans can destroy entire cities with a single weapon, then numerical comparisons no longer apply. They are not fighting the same war we are fighting. Foreign Minister Togo stared at the report, and if they have one such bomb, he said quietly, we must assume they have more. That single line shifted the tone from disbelief to existential dread. The room was no longer debating strategy, they were facing extinction. The Japanese understanding of American power had been constructed on deliberate self-deception. For years, intelligence officers had presented realistic data, industrial outputs, energy reserves, scientific infrastructure, all minimized or dismissed by high command. Since 1941, the Army's official doctrine had insisted that Japan's spirit and tactical brilliance would overcome material inferiority. It was national theology, not military analysis. That theology was now meeting its apocalypse. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had predicted this moment years earlier. Having studied at Harvard and served in Washington, he had seen America's factories firsthand. In 1941, before Pearl Harbor, he had warned the staff, "I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year, but I have no confidence for the second or third." His warnings were ignored, his realism branded defeatism. The irony was merciless. The very leadership that silenced Yamamoto's warnings now sat beneath concrete walls, reading the consequences of their own denial. They had gambled the survival of the empire on myths that distance, morale, and tactical superiority could balance against steel, oil, and electricity. Now a single flash over Hiroshima proved that distance meant nothing when a weapon could reach the heavens, that morale was meaningless when the body itself could be vaporized. The tactics were irrelevant when the battlefield was obliterated in an instant. Colonel Sato's analysis concluded with a line that no one dared contest. They have reached a level of power that makes resistance meaningless. We have been fighting a nation we never understood. The war room fell silent again, not with defiance this time, but with the stillness of realization. In that moment, 90 feet beneath Tokyo, the empire began to die, not through invasion, but through comprehension. By the morning of August 7, 1945, confirmation arrived that made the impossible undeniable. Reconnaissance aircraft dispatched over Hiroshima penetrated the haze at dawn and transmitted photographs that would horrify even hardened intelligence officers. The city center, once 4 square miles of wooden homes, factories, and government offices, was gone. Not burned, not shattered, but erased. The terrain was flattened to bare earth, scorched into glass. Trees had vanished. Shadows of people were imprinted on the pavement where bodies had once stood. Major Tsuneo Kitamura, the pilot of the first successful reconnaissance mission, reported weather phenomena unknown to science. Updrafts so violent they threw his plane thousands of feet in seconds. Air temperatures so high his instruments malfunctioned. His voice cracked over the radio, "There is no Hiroshima." At 14 hours, the Supreme War Council reconvened in Tokyo. The photographs were spread across the table, silent evidence that no amount of ideology could explain away. The images looked less like the aftermath of bombing and more like the aftermath of creation itself, something born from nothing, fire returning to silence. Then, another message arrived. At midnight, Moscow time, Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had summoned the Japanese ambassador, Naotake Sato, to the Kremlin. The message was devastatingly short. The Soviet Union will consider itself at war with Japan as of August 9th. Every remaining hope for negotiation collapsed. For months, Japan's diplomats had prayed that Stalin might mediate a conditional peace. That dream was gone. The empire now stood encircled, atomic fire from the east, Soviet armies from the north, and Allied fleets from every horizon. General Anami's face reportedly went pale as he grasped the implications. The imperial perimeter, the vast defensive arc stretching from Burma to the Marshalls, had imploded. Japan's remaining divisions were shattered, its fuel reserves nearly empty, its merchant fleet annihilated. The war that had begun with visions of divine destiny now narrowed to a single question: whether Japan would die by fire or by surrender. Foreign Minister Togo addressed the council with brutal clarity. "We have three choices. Surrender unconditionally. Fight until every city is destroyed by atomic weapons. Or resist until invasion erases Japan as a nation. There are no other options." That evening, word arrived from Manchuria. Soviet forces had crossed the border with overwhelming power tanks, mechanized infantry, and air support of a kind Japan's Kwantung Army could not imagine. Many of them supplied through America's Lend-Lease program. The Red Army advanced 50 miles in a single day. Japan's most prestigious army, once the pride of the empire, was being obliterated by men armed with American trucks, radios, and fuel. The cruel irony was complete. The same American industrial engine that had built the bomb was also fueling the Soviet invasion meant to crush Japan's final defenses. On August 9th, at 11:02 hours, Nagasaki vanished. The city's last transmission was only 4 words. Second atomic attack. City destroyed. Then silence. This time, there was no debate, only despair. The Supreme War Council convened again in emergency session. Admiral Mitsumasa Yonai, Navy Minister, spoke first. His tone was solemn, resigned. "The Americans have shown they can destroy our cities at will. They can continue this indefinitely. We cannot defend against what we cannot even see." General Umezu followed with a statement that, only weeks earlier, would have been considered treason. "The atomic bomb makes our strategy obsolete. Concentration is death. Civilians are targets. We no longer fight for victory, only for extinction." Colonel Sato's estimates projected that America might already possess up to 7 more atomic bombs, with the capacity to build one every 10 days. Even if that was an exaggeration, it made no difference. A single bomb per city was enough. Every major Japanese population center could vanish within a month. That night, Emperor Hirohito met with his inner circle. Cabinet Secretary Hisatsune Sakomizu recorded the meeting in his diary. The emperor spoke softly, but decisively. "The unendurable must be endured. Continued resistance will bring the annihilation of the Japanese people. We must accept the terms that preserve the nation." It was the first time the divine voice of the emperor had aligned with surrender. Yet outside that private chamber, generals still plotted resistance, determined to sacrifice the empire for honor's sake. Their logic was no longer strategic, but spiritual, a final act of defiance written in blood.
With each
By
passing
August
day in
10th,
August, the
Japan
inevitable drew
transmitted
closer.
its surrender offer through Swiss diplomatic channels. The proposal accepted the Potsdam Declaration on one condition: that the emperor's sovereignty be preserved. The American reply, received on August 12th, was ambiguous. The emperor would remain, but under the authority of the Allied commander, and his future status would depend on the freely expressed will of the Japanese people. That single phrase, freely expressed, will set off chaos within the military. To die for the emperor was acceptable. To surrender the emperor to foreign judgment was unthinkable. Anami's faction demanded continued war, even if it meant national suicide. Plans for a coup circulated in whispers through the corridors of the imperial palace. Still, the tide of reality was unstoppable. On August 14th, the emperor recorded his surrender speech, the first time his voice would ever be heard by his people. His chosen words were poetic but final. To continue the war would only result in the total extinction of human civilization. We must endure the unendurable. When the recording was smuggled past rebel officers and broadcast the next morning, a nation collapsed into silence.
They represent the
Some
freely
wept,
expressed
some
will.
refused to believe it, and some officers took their own lives in ritual defiance. But for the first time since 1937, Japan's cities heard not the sound of air raid sirens, but the sound of an ending. The war was over. What followed would not merely be surrender. It would be revelation, the slow, devastating comprehension of how profoundly Japan's leadership had misread the modern world. The formal process of surrender unfolded over the next 3 weeks, a political negotiation shadowed by disbelief and grief. But beneath the surface of ritualized diplomacy, something far deeper was happening. A complete collapse of the intellectual framework that had sustained Japan's war. The nation that had prided itself on discipline, sacrifice, and willpower was now forced to confront that courage. It had been fighting mathematics, and mathematics had won. On August 15th, as the emperor's voice echoed through the radio waves, the reaction was unlike anything the Home Ministry had anticipated. Millions of citizens knelt in silence, many weeping not only for the war's end, but for the death of meaning itself. Soldiers who had spent years preparing to die found themselves suddenly expected to live, to survive a defeat they had never imagined possible. Others, unable to reconcile surrender with honor, took their own lives. General Korechika Anami, the man who had sworn to fight until Japan ceased to exist, committed ritual suicide hours after the emperor's speech. His final words were a haunting acknowledgement. "I have done my utmost to serve my emperor. May I be forgiven for the end I could not prevent." While Tokyo processed spiritual collapse, Washington and Los Alamos were already calculating the industrial miracle behind the bombs. The atomic weapon dropped on Hiroshima, nicknamed Little Boy, had required a supply chain larger than most nations' entire economies. It drew uranium from Africa, graphite from American mines, and scientific knowledge from universities that Japan's intelligence officers had dismissed as theoretical. The total cost exceeded $2 billion more than Japan's military expenditure for the entire year of 1944. In Japan, the realization of this scale was almost incomprehensible. When occupation authorities began releasing data about the Manhattan Project, many scientists refused to believe it. Facilities in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, had consumed more electricity than all of Japan's major cities combined. The Americans had built entire towns, complete with schools, hospitals, and theaters dedicated to a single experiment: To Japanese planners who had rationed copper wiring by the meter and fuel by the gallon, this level of resource mobilization seemed godlike. The Supreme War Council's final meeting on August 16th was less an act of governance than of confession. Foreign Minister Togo, exhausted and gray, declared, "We did not lose to men, but to systems. The Americans built an army of ideas." Intelligence Colonel Sato presented one last report before burning most of his archives to prevent Allied confiscation. His analysis was titled "The Reality We Denied." In it, he admitted that Japan's intelligence community had, in fact, known much of what the Americans were building. They had intercepted mentions of secret research facilities, enormous power consumption, and a program employing over 100,000 engineers and scientists. But every warning had been dismissed by Tokyo as either enemy exaggeration or deliberate misinformation. "We chose not to believe," Sato wrote, "because belief in our own superiority was easier than facing the truth." By late August, as American troops began landing in Yokohama, even hardline generals could no longer cling to illusions. The sight that greeted them was overwhelming. American occupation divisions arrived with trucks, radio equipment, field hospitals, and engineering units that looked more like mobile cities than armies. A single U.S. infantry division brought more vehicles than the entire Imperial Army possessed. The contrast was biblical. Japan's soldiers marched on foot. The Americans moved in fleets. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri, the Empire of Japan formally surrendered. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu, walking with a cane and missing a leg, signed the instrument of surrender on behalf of the government. Opposite him stood General Douglas MacArthur, calm, impassive, the living symbol of the power that Japan had refused to understand. The harbor at Yokohama was filled with hundreds of American warships stretching beyond the horizon. Overhead, 450 carrier-based aircraft flew in precise formation, their collective roar drowning out all argument. General Yoshijiro Umezu, representing the Japanese General Staff, later wrote in his diary, "The Missouri was built in less time than it took us to plan a single naval campaign. They fought across 2 oceans and still built ships faster than we could repair them. We thought we were the warriors. They were the engineers." After the ceremony, American officers distributed booklets explaining Japan's disarmament procedures. Among the footnotes were statistics that stunned even the most informed Japanese officials. The United States had produced 88,410 tanks, 257,000 artillery pieces, 2.4 million trucks, 17 million rifles, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and yet American civilians had never experienced famine, and their living standards had risen during wartime. To a nation that had sacrificed everything for conquest and still starved, it was a revelation bordering on spiritual. Former Prime Minister Suzuki summarized the awakening bluntly during an interview with occupation historians. "We believed we were fighting a nation of merchants. We were wrong. We were fighting a civilization of manufacturers, the most productive in history. They made war as they made everything else, efficiently, scientifically, and endlessly." For Japan's generals, this was not merely defeat. It was exposure, the unmasking of a culture that had built its identity around mythic endurance while denying the arithmetic of reality. The atom bomb had not just destroyed cities, it had destroyed an entire worldview. As autumn descended over a ruined empire, Japan's remaining leaders began writing their reflections for the occupation government. Admiral Soimu Toyota, who had once sworn never to surrender, composed a quiet statement that captured the nation's transformation. We began this war believing that democracy made America weak, that diversity made it divided, that wealth made it soft. We ended understanding that democracy gave them innovation, diversity gave them talent, and wealth gave them the power to fight without exhaustion. Everything we believed was not merely wrong, it was reversed. The silence that followed the war was not the peace of victory. It was the silence of comprehension, the sound a civilization makes when it realizes it has mistaken faith for fact. The weeks following Japan's surrender were marked not by celebration, but by shock, the quiet, hollow kind that lingers after a civilization's self-image collapses. The country's cities lay in ruins, its people starving, its military dissolved. Yet what haunted Japan's leadership most wasn't the rubble, it was the realization that the war they thought they understood had never truly existed. When General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo to begin the occupation, Japanese officers observed his convoy with a mix of awe and disbelief. The Americans moved with calm efficiency, their vehicles gleaming, their uniforms immaculate. Even amid devastation, they seemed to carry abundance. Soldiers received fresh fruit, meat, and coffee luxuries unimaginable to Japanese troops who had survived on millet and seaweed. In one of his final intelligence memoranda, Colonel Sato noted dryly, "Their soldiers live better in our ruins than ours did in our cities." This was more than a logistical difference. It was a revelation of systems. The Americans had built an economy that could wage total war while sustaining civilian prosperity. They didn't merely outproduce Japan, they did so while planning the post-war world that would follow. Japan had mobilized desperation. America had mobilized civilization. In September 1945, as occupation administrators began their work, surviving Japanese scientists were granted access to fragments of information about the Manhattan Project. What they discovered bordered on the incomprehensible. The project had employed 130,000 people, cost nearly $2 billion, and consumed more electricity than Japan's industrial base. Its research network spanned the continent Oak Ridge, Hanford, Los Alamos, with universities like Harvard, Chicago, and Berkeley providing theoretical backbone. Japan's own wartime scientific corps, by contrast, had numbered fewer than 6,000. The contrast wasn't just quantitative, it was civilizational. The bomb wasn't merely a weapon, it was the visible tip of an invisible empire. One of engineers, physicists, chemists, and industrial planners working in synchronized secrecy. It was the ultimate expression of a society that had made knowledge its arsenal. The occupation's debriefings revealed this truth in brutal detail. American officials allowed Japanese officers to review wartime production charts. Aircraft production 1,944, US 96,000, Japan 28,000. Shipbuilding tonnage, US 39 million, Japan 4 million. Steel output, US 80 million tons, Japan barely 8. And yet, even as Japan collapsed, the United States still had reserves, fuel, labor, money left unused. Admiral Toyoda's post-war testimony captured the staggering asymmetry. We fought with everything we had. They fought with what they could spare. The irony was that America had never fought at full capacity, the same realization that had terrified Umezu on August 6th. Even at its peak, the U.S. war effort represented only a portion of its industrial potential. Japan had thrown the entirety of its existence into the war and lost to a country that hadn't even needed to try its hardest. By early 1946, occupation historians from the Allied command began collecting reflections from senior Japanese officers.
Sure is. Almost
One of
makes
the
you
most
forget the war.
haunting came from General Yoshijiro Umezu, who described Japan's defeat not as a military event, but as an intellectual collapse. We attributed to America our own weaknesses, narrow thought, limited resources, inflexible command. We could not imagine that democracy could coordinate millions for a single purpose. We confused loud voices for division and quiet planning for weakness. Umezu's insight touched the core of Japan's wartime blindness. The Imperial Command had believed that America's diversity was chaos, failing to understand that diversity meant adaptability. They believed individualism would fracture resolve, failing to see that it cultivated innovation. In trying to defeat modernity, Japan had declared war on the very forces that defined it. As the months passed, the occupation authorities made one symbolic decision that transformed the nation's psyche. They allowed Japan's people to read, in translation, portions of the Potsdam Declaration and the Manhattan Project summaries. Newspapers printed the figures, the industrial maps, the timelines. For the first time, ordinary citizens saw how large the world truly was and how small Japan had been inside it. In the burned remains of Hiroshima, scientists conducted field studies of the blast zone. The findings were chilling. Temperatures at ground zero had exceeded 4,000 degrees Celsius. Stone walls had melted into glass. The radiation had created soil compounds that no chemist had seen before. One physicist whispered, "It is as though the laws of nature were rewritten above this city." The Americans had not merely won the war, they had rewritten the rules of existence. Yet amid the ashes, a second realization took root, one that would define post-war Japan. If industrial weakness had doomed them, then knowledge, discipline, and modernization could redeem them. The same scientific spirit that had created the bomb could, if adopted, rebuild the nation. From that moment forward, Japan began to see technology not as a Western weapon, but as a universal language, one they would learn to speak fluently. By 1947, when occupation historians completed their final interviews with former military leaders, the transformation was complete. Pride had been replaced by clarity. The myth of invincibility had given way to humility and an obsession with precision, learning, and progress. General Umezu's final testimony to the American Research Committee would later be cited in textbooks. The atomic bomb did not defeat Japan. It revealed that we had been defeated long before defeated by ignorance, by arrogance, by a failure to see the nature of power. We learned too late that courage cannot replace chemistry, and that spirit means nothing without structure. The war that began in delusion ended in understanding, and understanding paid for in fire.